Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Absence Makes the Art Grow Finer. The dipole-friendly philosophies of Michel de Montaigne, Jean Starobinski, and Iain McGilchrist. Unless you begin to guard your mistress, she will soon begin to be no longer mine. Ovid. Why did Poppaea conceive the idea of masking the beauties of her face, except to make them dearer to her lovers? Montaigne. Well, hi everybody. And if it's not Beauty and the Beast, I'll put myself alongside old Poppaea here. And in case you weren't aware of Poppaea Sabina, she was, and this is where it gets interesting or difficult to disentangle truth from fiction and fact from fiction. But she was the second wife, I think, of Nero, the emperor. And she died, and how she died is immensely disputed, because one allegation was that she was pregnant and Nero stamped on her abdomen and she died from a miscarriage. But the problem is there were so many competing factions amongst Roman historians, and the politics of ancient Rome was so, vicious, that it's very difficult to get any consensus as to how true some of the stories were. So there's the allegation he murdered her, but then after that, the allegation is whether through guilt or the fact he always loved her, he became obsessed with her memory. And there was a young free man, that looked remarkably like his dead wife. So the story or the legend, or perhaps it was true, but he had this young freeman castrated, dressed up with makeup to look like his ex-wife Poppaea, and paraded around. And there's further complications because there were Roman feasts like Saturnalia, whereby the normal order of things was supposed to be turned upside down. And Nero loved acting, so it could have been he was making, and this is another element to the story, the boy that he turned into a version of his ex-wife was nicknamed Spurus, which apparently means semen. So the idea was it was extra satirical because he'd had been castrated, and yet that was his nickname. So all these things are going on, and part of the myth or the legend of Poppaea was that she veiled her face to make herself more attractive. So throughout art history, as you can see, there are various representations. This is a much later one. This is the School of Fontainbleu. And you can see the diaphanous, it's a bit counterintuitive because it's diaphanous gauze that you can see straight through. But the notion of, veiling is still there. But anyway, I just thought I'd give you the background to that first reference to Poppaea, because it's from Jean Starobinski, and I will explain the relevance of Poppaea to him, because he's talking about the nature of the way we look, the gaze, and also desire, and how they work in tandem or in opposition to create desirous effects. So that's why he mentions Poppaea. So, to be fascinated is the height of distraction. And this is Starobinski. And Jean Starobinski is a fascinating character. He was a 20th century thinker, literary critic. I think he also trained in medicine. He definitely studied medicine, and I think he qualified as a physician. But he was mostly known for literary criticism and art criticism, and sometimes the combination of the two. And there's a book he wrote in French, it's L'Œil Vivant, The Living Eye, and I'm guessing there's about 6 or 7 of his books have been translated into English. So he's not particularly well known in the Anglosphere. He was born in Geneva, he's Swiss, and he's just a brilliant writer. So in L'Œil Vivant, The Living Eye, I've taken some quotes today, and whenever they're from Starobinski, I'll point them out. But it's from the first 3 pages, and there's quite a few quotes because he writes like an absolute angel. And if you have any skills in French, I really do beseech you to check out the original French. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. But it's just a good sign of a great writer when in translation it still reads absolutely beautifully. And he advised the translation of his work into English, so he had some input into that. So perhaps that's one of the reasons the translation is so good, because he oversaw it to some extent. Anyway, this idea that to be fascinated is the height of distraction. There's this immediate ambivalence between to be fascinated and to be distracted. So fascination implies some almost active concentration, but distraction obviously suggests the opposite. And this notion of things existing in opposition. In a previous video, I introduced the concept from Iain McGilchrist, the idea of dipoles in physics and magnetic fields. So there's electrical and magnetic fields. And I'll show you in a second. I'll repeat the diagram I've used before. But part of Iain McGilchrist's whole approach to the interrelationship between neuroscience, how the brain, the 2 different hemispheres, the left and right, operate, and how that impacts upon our culture and vice versa. One of his contributions to that interaction of different hemispheres and sometimes opposite states in nature and physics, he uses the concept of dipoles. And I wanted today to make the links between Iain McGilchrist as a neuroscientist. I think he started out from a literature background. So he's already quite receptive to the idea that art can play a valuable role in human understanding beyond science, beyond neuroscience. In fact, it massively helps understand how the brain works. And Iain McGilchrist's constant shtick is that the left-hand side of our brain, the left hemisphere, in modern contemporary culture has been overprivileged. And the left-hand side of the brain tends to be more akin to the activities associated with science, with hard rationality, with quantitative thinking. And the right-hand side of the brain lends itself more to creativity, to artistic patterns. And McGilchrist is consistent. He says you need both sides of the brain, and they operate, although the brain has an asymmetric structure, it's split, it's bifurcated into 2 parts, that they're supposed to, the 2 hemispheres are needed to be separate, but they also are designed to work in conjunction. And the problem in his eyes is that in our modern society, we've gone too far to almost complete reliance upon the left-hand side of the brain. So in his eyes, and definitely in my eyes, the idea that art, which tends to be more associated with the right hemisphere, that has a crucial role to play. And McGilchrist goes on to argue that many issues in modern society, like the increased diagnoses of autism, and I would argue that the fact we live in increasingly ideological and intolerant times, is possibly, it doesn't help that we're increasingly losing touch with the right hemisphere of our brain and how to make the most of it. But anyway, to get on with the point. So it is to be prodigiously inattentive to the world as it is. So this is relating to the title. It was a previous sentence. To be fascinated is the height of distraction. It is to be prodigiously inattentive to the world as it is. But this inattention, in a way, rests upon the very objects it neglects. Having responded too impetuously to the veiled seductress, our gaze hurtles beyond the possessible body and is captured by the void and consumed in the night. Poppaea Sabina allows her body to be glimpsed beneath the gauze and smiles. She is not culpable. Her lovers do not die for her. They die for the promises she does not keep. So I'm wanting to link, this is quite arty-farty and abstract, but I'll be linking it to McGilchrist to ground it in more neuroscientific terms. And as we go along, I'll also be quoting Michel de Montaigne, 17th century, was it 17th? Sorry, 16th century, part of the French philosophical Renaissance. And Montaigne also has notions that Starobinski draws upon that relate to this concept of dipoles. I'm suggesting the concept of a dipole links these three thinkers. And in this case, Starobinski is making a point. He's contrasting fascination with distraction, but also showing how they're innately, inextricably imbricated, they're linked together. So, but this inattention, in a way, rests upon the very objects it neglects. So in artistic, when you're fascinated and when you're looking, you lose yourself, you're absorbed by a work of art. The fascination creates a weird form of inattention, but the inattention, the fascination, the like feeling like you're moving outside of yourself, whilst it is a form of inattention, it also absolutely requires the artistic object to stimulate this type of response. So fascination and distraction are this strange dipole in a sense. So having responded too impetuously to the veiled seductress, i.e. Poppaea, our gaze hurtles beyond the possessible body and is captured by the void and consumed in the night. So in that portrait of Poppaea, it's interesting, there's darkness and blackness in the background. And it reminds me, I've used in a couple of videos now, the girl with the pearl earring and the darkness behind her, and how that, ironically, counterintuitively perhaps, that darkness is an essential part of the painting. And the notion of darkness and the void, I'm going to suggest as we go along, it's an essential element of Rothko's work, it's an essential element of Van Gogh's work. There are various artists, I could go on, but that use darkness and blackness, or bad light, dusk. We'll see in a moment a painting by Caspar David Friederich, in which he makes use of the gloom, the dark, the dying of the day. So it's a brilliant sentence. Her lovers do not die for her. They die for the promises she does not keep. But just he's suggesting, Starobinski, that the desire, ironically, is only loosely linked to its prime cause, whatever object or person that is in the real world. And quite quickly it moves beyond that and becomes a very amorphous, void-like thing, captured by the void and consumed in the night. But anyway, to bring this back to more practical concerns. So this is just a visual summary of the concepts that Iain McGilchrist is conveying. So in physics, a dipole, from the Greek for twice, and axis, so there's two axes. So in physics, it's well recognized that you have electric and magnetic dipoles. And in Iain McGilchrist's theory of the brain, the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, I would suggest, have this dipole type structure also. And what I love about Iain McGilchrist's work is that as a neuroscientist, he wants to show how the nature of the human brain interacts with the world in a way that is mediated by dipole structures. And that's what sets him out as quite unusual, because he's very wedded, I think, by religion. He's a Taoist, but he's very related to how we exist within the world and not just working to understand human existence through an abstract quantitative scientific method. He's using science to try and show how the brain uses innate ambiguity and uses the innate dipole relationship between the left and right hemisphere. And that is part of how we experience the world. So he's quite against some modern scientists' tendency to always seek to quantify and abstract and take away from the complexity of the world and reduce it down to its most simple, essential elements, whereas he is consistently arguing that the ambiguity and complexity of the world is innate to the way the human brain is designed to experience it, which I'll give you some precise examples of. But this notion of the creativity behind dipoles is the single most relevant feature of dipoles to art. So he says, this is McGilchrist, relationships can be understood only through images or metaphors. For example, the well-known one offered by Hegel. The bud gives way to the flower, which is the fulfillment and yet the repudiation of the bud. The flower gives way to the fruit, which is the fulfillment and yet the repudiation of the flower. This process, which Hegel refers to as Aufhebung, sublation or lifting up or transcending, means the carrying up into a higher realm. Thus, apparent opposites, according to the linear left hemisphere way of thinking, elements in sequence often turn out to collaborate in fulfilling their ends. Things and their opposites depend on one another for their being, bring about something new through their opposition, and ultimately co-create the world. They are dipoles. So I've used this quote before and I've explained it, but I wanted just to revisit it in order to give you different examples, just to illustrate it in slightly different ways. But I just love this idea. It strikes me as intuitively very convincing, and this is one of the things Iain McGilchrist has said about his own work and why he thinks it's been so well received in recent years. He says many people have said to him, "You've put in scientific terms what I've always intuitively suspected of how we live in the world." And people from an artistic background have been very grateful that he's added credence to the crucially important way in which art contributes to our understanding of the world. So I've also used this, but I'll just quickly go through this because you've got left hemisphere, right hemisphere dipole, but you've also got this anterior, posterior axis, so the relationship between the front of the brain and the back of the brain. And I think this is also crucial. The huge amount of writing Iain McGilchrist's two massive volumes, the Matter with Things, they're called, Volume 1 and 2. I'm just picking out two very small points. So he says the frontal lobe is a percentage of the total brain. In dogs, it's 18%, monkeys 30%, great apes 35%, and humans 37%. So the frontal lobe is disproportionately large in human beings, and he explains the significance of that. And what is the frontal cortex for? Largely for stopping things happening. To members of a society in which doing things is much more highly valued than desisting from doing things, this might seem paradoxical. Yet this negation is highly creative. It puts necessary distance in time and space between ourselves and the immediacy of experience. This enables us to stand back and see things in perspective. It enables us to delay gratification in order to achieve a greater end. There is a proper distance between ourselves and the world, which enables us to see what is going on. And I just think this is absolutely crucial. This idea that paradoxically, the frontal cortex is to make us step back and not just dive straight in impulsively. And he says it so, concisely and explicitly. it might seem that paradoxical, that desisting from doing things is an important part of brain function. Yet this negation is highly creative. It puts necessary distance in time and space between ourselves and the immediacy of experience. There is a proper distance between ourselves and the world which enables us to see what is going on. And I'd ask you just to keep that phrase in mind, this idea of the proper distance. Because I think that is one of the major roles art, whether it's literary, written texts, or visual art, plays in human experience. And I think Iain McGilchrist's work backs that up quite strongly. So this notion of necessary distance, and it relates, and this is where Starobinski starts coming into it, and also Michel de Montaigne. They both, and Starobinski quotes Montaigne. And Montaigne was a fascinating character because in the 16th century he popularized the philosophical essay as a literary form. And he, and also later obviously Starobinski, but they are interested with the way in which desire is created through barriers and oppositional forces. And desire in Lacanian psychoanalysis also, it's this notion that desire is it's a relational concept. So desire paradoxically requires non-satiation. So you can desire food, but the minute you've stuffed your face with food, it's very difficult, unless you really have pathological appetite problems, a bit like myself, but you really struggle then to have the same level of desire because you've satiated your craving for food. But lots of desire isn't like that. It can't be satiated. Desire by definition requires a distance from the thing being desired and your ability to achieve it. And that is the source of lots of brilliant art. So there is a proper distance between ourselves and the world which enables us to see what is going on. It's like trying to read a book, this is still McGilchrist, it's like trying to read a book too close and one cannot see anything, too far away and one cannot make out the text. And this is true of all human experiences. All require and benefit from necessary distance. Thus, if the relationship between the frontal and posterior cortex is antagonistic, yet it is in pursuit of the same goals, negation is not by any means merely negative. And this might sound really technical, he's talking about brain function and stuff, but think back to my examples I've used with things like the girl with the pearl earring and the blackness of the background. The blackness of the background, and I'll give you further examples later on from different artists, but in a good artist, blackness or lack of colour or shadow or shade, these things aren't just an absence of technical ability. Often they're an essential part of the artwork as a whole. So this idea that negation is not by any means merely negative, I think is a crucial point. And to give you an example, negation is not by any means merely negative. Here's an example from our friend Vincent. And what I'd suggest here is significant is, I think, is it the Book of Daniel, but there's certainly some biblical references to the notion of an empty chair or an empty throne. But the idea is that this is Vincent van Gogh's chair, and it's more than just, it's the lack of someone sitting in the chair. Obviously the chair represents Vincent van Gogh himself, and the fact he's not there, his little pipe, his personal objects on the chair. So this, just in a very simple way, is expressing someone can be absent but still present in a certain sense. or you can portray positively the negative presence or the absence of someone. So that chair is infused with the fact it's Vincent. I think I can call him Vincent on first name terms. So I'll give you more examples as we go along, but because it sounds, rather convoluted. But it's almost a theme. It's almost very similar to a theme that runs through Sartre's Being and Nothingness. The idea that being is suffused with not being, with nothingness. And from memory, the idea, one of the examples he gives is in waiting in a cafe. Is it Pierre, I think? He's waiting for someone, and the idea is that when you're waiting for someone, your whole experience of the environment you're in is again suffused by not the presence, but the absence of the person you're expecting. So this idea that absence and nothingness, they're not nothing. They have a productive role in human experience. And periodically, it's presented to us in artwork like this. And it's quite poignant. If I read in the last video, some excerpts from a letter Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo. I think it was June 1880. But this was when I think he was staying in something called the Yellow House, but he was staying with, or he was waiting for Gogh, a fellow artist, to arrive. And they did spend time together, but Gogh eventually ran off when Vincent van Gogh had a psychotic episode and chopped off his ear. But I believe this is Gauguin's chair with some of Gauguin's belongings on it. So again, and the poignancy, so it just reminds me of the fact that, Vincent van Gogh wanted his friendship with Gauguin to work so much, but ultimately his mental illness completely ruined it. And I think there's a gaslight in the background, and I'm sure I read somewhere that he got gaslights installed as part of the enticement to get Gauguin to come and stay with him. So you've got the gaslight and the candle, the old and the new together. So again, in McGilchrist, the role played by distance in the right and left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere enables us to feel empathy, feeling our way into what it is like to be another, to interpret social signals such as humour or irony, oblique and intuitive signals from face and posture and tone of voice, and enable us to make sense of the world around us, to see the connections. It must be able to integrate experience over time through memory. It will facilitate the human desire for exploration of the world. So in various videos, I've borderline obsessed with Proust, but this idea, it must be able to integrate experience over time through memory. That's the whole constant theme of In Search of Lost Time. Thousands of pages devoted to precisely that exploration of the world through memory over time. The left hemisphere, by contrast, it will develop emotional distance from the other. It will be focused not so much on the past as on the future. In order to do this, it needs to go offline, if you like, from the real world and be able to consider various possible courses of action in a virtual fashion. For this, reality needs to be drastically simplified, represented, rather than actually present with all the obfuscating complexity that would bring with it. It needs to be mapped. The left frontal cortex will facilitate knowledge, not of the terrain, but of the territory. It will facilitate the human desire for exploitation more than exploration of the world. In the previous Iain McGilchrist theme talk I gave, I think at this point I quoted, it's originally from a Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, a short story. And Baudrillard, Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher, used the section as his way of expressing exactly this point. The Borges quote, it's a short story, a fictional piece about an empire in which a one-to-one, a complete map of the empire is made, and the actual empire decays and wastes away, and all you're left with is the copy. And the parallel made is that's similar to the situation we find ourselves in, is how Baudrillard describes it. The previous reality has given over, and there's a phrase somewhere in the now, the map precedes the territory. There's been a reversal. Rather than representing and mapping, we are now living in the map, is the idea. So on to trying to link all this to Michel de Montaigne, and there's some of his essays online readily available, which is, I think, where I took some of these quotes, because I'm not sure the translation I'm using is the best, but forgive me, rather than laboriously type them out from one of my hard copy, there's an Everyman complete works of Montaigne I was using, but I think that's a better translation to this, but it's serviceable. So the title of this particular essay is at the bottom there, that our desire is increased by difficulty. There is no reason that has not its contrary, say the wisest of the philosophers. I was just now ruminating on the excellent saying one of the ancients alleges for the contempt of life. No good can bring pleasure unless it be that for the loss of which we are beforehand prepared. And then there's the Latin for the following phrase by Seneca. The grief of losing a thing and the fear of losing it are equal. Meaning by this that the fruition of life cannot be truly pleasant to us if we are in fear of losing it. So I think it's a great expression. No good can bring pleasure unless it be that for the loss of which we are beforehand prepared. And why I wanted to emphasize this, well, there's two elements. First of all, there's the first sentence. There is no reason that has not its contrary. So that goes towards this concept of dipoles that we've already discussed. But then the idea that fear of losing a thing is as bad as actually losing it. So we need to find ways to get over our fear. The fruition of life cannot be truly pleasant to us if we are in fear of losing it. So what I wanted to suggest was, to the extent to which it struck me that a lot of the art I like and a lot of the art I've used on this channel, from a certain perspective, could be seen as quite depressing and morbid. But actually, I think it addresses this point, that if you can consume art that deals with mortality and otherwise perhaps viewed to be morbid topics, but it sublimates it into an artistic form, that I would suggest is a good way to prepare for the inevitable. It helps with or counteracts fear of losing life if you can actually enjoy depictions of the inevitable loss of life that just living as a human being will necessarily involve. And to give you an example of, rather than just talk at the issue, to show you a Caspar David Friederich example of this. So this is one of his famous pictures of an abbey, obviously abandoned. And on the one hand, you could argue, well, it doesn't get much more bloody miserable than that, Paul. But on the other hand, I would just suggest it's stunningly beautiful, and it's a funeral. They're taking, you're assuming, one of their co-brothers from a nearby monastery under the previous arch. They look like they're carrying a coffin on their shoulders, and there's a procession. And there's quite, the ramshackle graveyards. There's the crucifixes on the graves at odd angles. It's obviously not well kept. But, seemingly dark, absolutely miserable topic, but the way it's presented, I'd suggest just stunningly, aesthetically beautiful. So to give you an example, what I would suggest are some of Montaigne's dipoles. So this is from his essay that I previously quoted from. It might, however, be said, on the contrary, that we hug and embrace this good so much the more earnestly and with so much greater affection by how much we see it the less assured and fear to have it taken from us. For it is evident, as fire burns with greater fury when cold comes to mix with it, that our will is more obstinate by being opposed. So I'm suggesting, if you think back to what I was saying about Iain McGilchrist and the concept of dipoles, and Starobinski, similarly, this is within Michel de Montaigne's essay. I just think it's a beautiful way of portraying the same concept of a dipole. As fire burns with greater fury when cold comes to mix with it, that our will is more obstinate by being opposed. Again, it's this thing that negation is not just a purely negative thing. Negation, opposition, cold and hot, it generates this transcendence that was previously cited with regard to Hegel, Aufhebung. This thing that's raised up, the generation of something else from a previous opposition. It's known as the Hegelian dialectic, the thesis, the synthesis. Sorry, the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis, and that's called the Hegelian dialectic. And that there is nothing naturally so contrary to our taste as satiety which proceeds from facility, nor anything that so much whets it as rarity and difficulty. The pleasure of all things increases by the same danger that should deter it. So again, Seneca, who maybe another time I'll do a talk on. Seneca had a fascinating life in the court of Nero, just spending every day trying to get through to the next day because Nero was so capricious. But this idea that, again, the opposition, the pleasure of all things increases by the same danger that should deter it. Often pleasurable things in life are a direct result of the difficulty with which they're achieved. So you could ask yourself, why does any sane person engage in extremely dangerous sports, like, free form rock climbing, or certain motorsports where if you fall off the bike, you risk immediate death. The difficulty and the enjoyment, that they are what go together to create the whole reason for doing it. And again, just to give you a visual portrayal of this, another Caspar David Friederich painting that I'm very fond of, I think the original German title is Das Eismeer, the Sea of Ice. But I'd suggest, in relation to what I've previously been discussing about dipoles, the beauty of this scene, just the absolute, it almost looks like cement and concrete, the ice, the rust-coloured iron, almost coloured, in the foreground, and just these huge blocks of, almost like granite, cement, whatever you want to call, but it's nature's sheer and absolute power. And then you'd almost be forgiven for missing, in the midst of all this, the ship that failed to get through. But that's what human beings do. That, part of the frightening beauty of nature is its absolute, implicit danger of trying to confront it. Which I just think is all a very long-winded way of saying, basically, no pain, no gain. So this concept that the hidden fascinates. I think we're back to Starobinski. In dissimulation and absence, there is a strange force that compels the spirit to turn toward the inaccessible, and for the sake of conquest, to sacrifice all it possesses. Fairy tales, works of realism as far as the mechanism of desire is concerned, know only hidden treasures concealed in some dark depth. If these treasures must belong to someone, they will go to the one who has renounced everything, even the hope of becoming their master. So it's one aspect of good art, and again, I keep using the phrase, it's paradoxical or counterintuitive, but it is. It's this enigmatic quality. In dissimulation and absence, there is a strange force. So again, Girl with the Pearl Earring, the blackness in the background, from which the face of the girl with the pearl earring comes from. That's what's inaccessible. Is the face coming away from that blackness or going back into that blackness? That's the inaccessible. And then I just love this phrase, fairy tales, which could not be more unrealistic, could not be more imagined. Yet, Starobinski brilliantly expresses it, works of realism as far as the mechanism of desire is concerned. So what he's saying is fairy tales provide condensed accounts of how human desire actually works. And arguably, I could spend time explaining that I don't have, but the slight distinction between mythology and fairy tales. But in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, similarly, some of the stories, so off the top of my head, Pandora's box, the fact that, which should have been Pandora's urn, but it got mistranslated as Pandora's box. But the idea that Pandora could not help looking inside the urn. The curiosity, the desire to look. So that would be a mythological example. In fairy tales, there's Bluebird's wives. He tells them never to go in to the locked room or else. And I stayed in a London hotel, and for some reason, by overflow, whatever, I got a room that was normally given to disabled people, and just wasn't paying attention. So I obviously had a massive shower, but one of the aspects of the room was there was a safety button, and there was a sign next to it saying, pressing it, something like, I forgot what the actual phrasing was, but it was along the lines of, do not press unless you absolutely have to. And, for a supposedly bright person, a mature adult, idiot here, pressed the button just to see what it would do. Just because the sign said not to. And they've done loads of psychological experiments where that's what happens. You tell someone not to do something. So these two poor receptionists came running up thinking, why has he pressed the button? He was a relatively able-bodied person who's in that room. And I had to apologise profusely, and just the only defence I had was I'm an idiot. Fond memories. But then it's more poignant, to be more serious for a second. If these treasures must belong to someone, they will go to the one who has renounced everything, even the hope of becoming their master. And that just reminds me of Van Gogh. The idea, in one of my videos, I looked at the tree roots and the wheat field with crows, the two last paintings he did, and the way in which, in his letters to his family members, he renounced everything in order to be the best artist he possibly could, or because that's what he was searching for. The hidden is the other side of a present, the power of absence. If we attempt to describe it, leads us to the power possessed in varying degrees by certain real objects. These objects point beyond themselves toward a magical space. They are indices of something they are not. The fascination emanates from a real presence that obliges us to prefer what it hides, to prefer something remote, which it prevents us from attaining even as it offers itself. Our gaze is irresistibly drawn into the vertiginous void that forms in the object of fascination. An infinity opens up, devouring the real object by which it made itself sensible. And I just think this is an absolutely brilliant Starobinski describing the dipole of presence and absence in art. The way in which these objects point beyond themselves towards a magical space. So in a second, I'm going to give you a figurative example. So recognizable objects that create this effect. But I'd suggest this sentence, our gaze is irresistibly drawn into the vertiginous void that forms in the object of fascination. That would also apply to abstract art, so Rothko and co. An infinity opens up, devouring the real object by which it made itself sensible. It's almost like people like Rothko have left that step, that the notion of the real object. The real object has long been left behind. They've gone straight for the abstraction. So eventually I'll be doing videos on Malevich and people like him, the notion of the black square. The way in which increasingly abstract art goes for the purity of, it's almost like an artistic exploration of this vertiginous void. It's almost going directly to the subject, the experience of fascination, without the need for real objects. But remaining with real objects, I'm going to do, it's going to be more than one video, and don't laugh, but on just this one painting. Because in the philosophy of art, there was a huge debate. Martin Heidegger, in his essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, refers to this painting. And later on, I think that was 1935, and in 1968, there was a famous American art critic, Meyer Shapiro, who took issue with Heidegger's interpretation. So there was a massive academic-like spat over the significance of these boots. But if you link these boots to the previous quote, what Heidegger does, and I'll explain later on in a different video why Shapiro takes issue with him. But Heidegger uses these boots as a riff on the peasant. They don't necessarily look like women's boots to me, but Heidegger claims they're a peasant woman's boots. And then he uses that to riff on the nature of the peasant lifestyle and what these boots say of that lifestyle. So Heidegger uses the boots to talk about something that isn't in the painting, but it is implied in the painting. So there's absence and presence contained. These boots contain the soil of a peasant's life. And the notion of, the vertiginous void, just, you almost take for granted that the background to this painting is almost just a lighter version of the shading used predominantly in the boots themselves. But it's the vertiginous void. Because you're looking at two boots, I think people overlook the void-like nature of the background from which these boots are almost hovering. It's not, they're solid objects, but they're not in a solid, obviously solid space framing them. But I risk going on and on about this, so I'll save it for another. If you find these boots fascinating, your luck is in. There will be at least one full, maybe more, video on this. But for the purposes of this talk, all I really wanted to do was emphasize the notion of objects in art aren't just self-contained objects. You don't necessarily have to agree with Heidegger, but I would suggest you can't help but be aware of the thing that is absent from these boots that is intrinsically linked to those boots. In other words, the owner who wears them every day in the muddy fields. So absence and presence are in this depiction. They're a dipole that create the overall effect that arguably fascinates, along with the dipole of the substantial objecthood of the boots compared with the lack, the vertiginous void, the absence of the background in which these boots are being presented to you as the viewer of the painting. And later on, this was a photograph taken by Walker Evans with, as you can see, a very similar theme. And if you go from one to the other, I'd suggest that it's interesting that I would argue strongly that this painting is much more evocative. That the photograph isn't, it's not completely lacking in being able to evoke feelings. But I just think it goes to show the power of painting over, I would suggest, maybe I'm just anti-photography, so forgive me if it comes across that way, but I would suggest this has a much more profound effect than that. It would be interesting if others have completely the opposite reaction, whether they find this more poignant because they can more readily identify with a pair of more photographable, accurate empty boots. But I just strongly feel that to the extent that this photograph works, it works because it evokes partially the full effect of the Van Gogh painting. I just don't think the Van Gogh painting suffers in comparison with this. In fact, I just think it's much stronger. But anyway, competition between painting and photography I want to avoid. In truth, if the object of fascination calls for the abdication of our will, it is because that object itself is annihilated by the absence it provokes. This strange power, in a way, stems from a lack an insufficiency in the object. Rather than hold our fascination, it allows itself to be transcended in a perspective of the imagination, an obscure dimension. But objects can seem insufficient only in response to an exigency in our gaze, which, awakened to desire by an elusive presence, and finding no employment for all its energies in the visible thing, transcends it and loses itself in an empty space, headed for a beyond from which there is no return. I just think this is an absolutely wonderful summary of, and I'll probably use this quote again when I look in future back at abstract art. That object itself is annihilated by the absence it provokes. This notion of an obscure dimension transcends it and loses itself in an empty space, headed for a beyond from which there is no return. So I'm just suggesting this is almost like a manifesto for abstract art. But I want to give you a very specific example because, as always, I'm trying to get an interplay going between the words used to describe. So Starobinski doing his level best to put into words what art can achieve and how art does it. And I'll give you the title, not immediately, but the next painting I just think is absolutely, it sums up this quotation absolutely brilliantly. And I won't give the title straight away and I won't say anything more while you look at the next painting, but I'd be fascinated to know what your initial impression is of what the painting is about. And then whether, once you learn the name of the painting that's been given to it, whether that, to what extent that makes a difference to your appreciation of the painting. Which, what I'm, clumsily saying is, I'm trying to illustrate the way in which words and paintings go together and how they actually can influence each other and create more than the sum of their parts, perhaps. And I don't know what it is, because it's not, you can't say it's an underrated novel, Moby Dick, because it's very famous. But I think it's one of those books that people know of or mention far more than anyone bothers to read it anymore. I get the sense that in American high schools, kids are forced to read it, perhaps because it's a great American classic, but definitely in the UK and Europe, I don't think it gets anywhere near the recognition it should. And what people don't realise is Moby Dick, the novel, there are sections of it that are laugh out loud funny, that are just brilliantly... there's experimental sections that's almost like surrealist Shakespeare scenes. There's just so much going on. And it struck me that if I was going to try and portray the whale, there's some Turner paintings that almost you could think give a sense of Moby Dick and the atmosphere at sea. But actually, if you remember the basic substance of the previous quotation about the role of absence and its paradoxical relationship to actual objects, I just think this is an absolutely brilliant portrayal of not just the size of Moby Dick, but the void within which Moby Dick operates. I think the absolute strength of this portrayal is that it's abstract. If that showed much more identifiable features of an actual whale, I think it would lose something of the effect. Just the the vast amorphousness of the actual depiction of the loose depiction of the whale, and the lighting, and the abstract aqueous quality of it all goes together absolutely brilliantly, and again just manages to portray, through a lack of portrayal, the actual notion of the whale Moby Dick. And just for information, the Marcelle Loubchansky was a French female artist, if the name might make you think she was Eastern European. So I'll begin to sum up now, but this idea, it's difficult for the gaze to limit itself to ascertaining appearances. The gaze is greedy. The gaze wants more than it can possibly have, and that's, I think, desire was mentioned quite early on in the talk in one of the quotations, but this relationship between the gaze and desire. By its very nature, it must ask for more. In fact, this impatience inhabits all the senses. Beyond the usual synesthesias, each sense aspires to exchange its powers with the others. In a celebrated elegy, Goethe said, "The hands want to see, the eyes want to caress." We may add, the gaze wants to speak. It is willing to give up the faculty of immediate perception in exchange for the gift of fixing more permanently whatever flees its grasp. By contrast, speech often seeks to efface itself in order to clear the way for pure vision, for intuition perfectly oblivious of the noise of words. In each realm, the highest powers are apparently those that impose a sudden, overwhelming substitution. So why I love this is, I've mentioned at various points in previous videos the concept of ekphrasis, the Greek idea of talking about words, talking about pictures and paintings, talking about visual art. So it's a different medium, but you're trying to put into words what paintings and pictures are achieving. And this is Starobinski showing how the various modes of understanding mutually reinforce each other. So speech giving way to pure vision giving way to speech. And ideally, being conversant with both images and words gets the best of all possible worlds without sounding like Dr. Pangloss. So in each realm, the highest powers are apparently those that impose a sudden, overwhelming substitution. It's just a great way of describing that great art at its peak in a certain format almost gives itself over to a different art. So the gaze wants to speak. It is willing to give up the faculty of immediate perception in exchange for the gift of fixing more permanently whatever flees its grasp. So sight is by its nature transitory, evanescent, whereas speech, words, can fix to some extent the sensation, the perception. Schools of aesthetic thought can be built up using words that can be passed down, and art can be appreciated through generations in various ways. While simultaneously the beauty of art is still transitory, it's still visually based. So there's this constant interaction going on between fixing the effect, but the true art being inherently transitory. And there's this constant tension. The shadow has the power to make us release all our prey simply because it is a shadow, because it is shadow, and provokes us in a nameless anticipation. Fascination persuades us so that we may belong to it, to give up everything, even concern for our own lives. It takes all we have simply by promising everything we want. At first we were able to dream of laying hold of what lay hidden, but the roles were quickly reversed. All at once we found ourselves passive and paralysed, having renounced our will and allowed ourselves to be inhabited by the imperious call of absence. I don't think I've seen a better description of shadow that at the beginning provokes us in a nameless anticipation. And then at the end, all at once we found ourselves passive and paralysed, having renounced our will and allowed ourselves to be inhabited by the imperious call of absence. So if you think of that sentence and the previous one about nameless anticipation and the whole concept of shadow, I always come back to, I could have shown you different De Chiricos, but apologies. I'll always come back to this miserable one. Just the nameless anticipation, like what's going on in that shadow. There's the boxcar on the right. There's the portico on the right, the deep recesses we can't see into. There's the dark shadow in the foreground, and then there's the girl who's mostly basically a mobile shadow, even though it actually is a human figure with its own shadow. But then just the disturbing shadow that she seems to be moving towards. I just think if you think of the previous quotation, De Chirico, in my mind, is the best exemplar of the sense of that quotation. And again, that goes to the idea a certain artist can bring out and illustrate the truth of words, but you also need those words to orientate yourself sometimes to fully appreciate the visual aspects of certain painters. So I'm going to put all this now, as we come to an end, in opposition to the non-artistic approach to life. So some, invoking the example of Greece, have argued that the realm of the visible, the realm of light, I think he's talking about Plato's ideal forms here, was also the realm of measure and order, figures circumscribed by their forms, space made rhythmic by a harmonious module, by a law granting to each vantage an empire at once sovereign and precarious. But there is a hidden extravagance in the apparent triumph of measure. The will to delineate, geometrize, and fix stable relationships implies a violence beyond the natural experience of the gaze. The space of geometrical measurement is the product of a vigilant effort which, compass in hand, revises the affective prejudices to which living space owes its deformations. It is hard to deny that in this there is extravagance of the second degree, which consists in seeking equilibrium by rejecting the spontaneous extravagance of desire and anxiety. So this is Starobinski he starts off a beautiful way of describing the scientific mentality, the realm of measure and order, figures circumscribed by their forms, space made rhythmic by a harmonious module. So in Iain McGilchrist terms, this is left brain hemisphere. This is how the left brain conceptualizes. But the second half of this quotation is absolutely brilliant, because he's saying that affective prejudices, living space, space as lived by human beings, is not geometric. We live in a human space that has this last phrase, the spontaneous extravagance of desire and anxiety. Geometric quantitative space is denuded of those qualities that are essential to the human condition. And this is Iain McGilchrist's argument. If you live in a world that's dominated by the geometric, the delineation, geometrized and fixed stable relationships implies a violence beyond the natural experience of the gaze. This goes back to Iain McGilchrist's previous quote earlier on about the difference between exploration on the right hemisphere of the brain and exploitation on the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere of the brain rejects the spontaneous extravagance of desire and anxiety. So Starobinski is not saying exactly what Iain McGilchrist is saying, but I honestly think they're saying the same thing in different ways. One's a neuroscientist, one's a literary critic. And that's why I find Iain McGilchrist so fascinating and important, because he offers scientific validation for being more realistic about the viable scope of science and understanding this idea of the violence beyond the natural experience of the gaze. There's a certain violent quality to overly reductionist scientific approach to the world. And just to give you a visual example, this is a visual example of what Starobinski's talking about. So in all the other images I've shown you, there's an affective quality, there's an emotional quality. Whereas this is just showing you the mathematical, the geometrical understanding of the space. But it's cold, it's lacking in effect. We don't live perceptually in physical space like this. But arguably, in contemporary media-dominated society, this is the depiction of space that we've become more and more used to. I'm just going back to this. Revises the affective prejudices to which a living space owes its deformation. So for Starobinski, the deformations of space, because we have affective prejudices, in other words, our human sensorium is not geometric, it's not scientific. It contains the spontaneous extravagance of desire and anxiety. It's not this, although this is increasingly the representational space we exist in. This is the map, not the territory. To make the link to the earlier Borges quote. So if one looks at the etymology, one finds that to denote directed vision, French resorts to the word regard, gaze, whose root originally referred not to the act of seeing, but to expectation, concern, watchfulness, consideration, and safeguard, made emphatic by the addition of a prefix expressing a redoubling or return. Regarder, to look at, to gaze upon, is a movement that aims to recapture. Reprendre sous garde, to place in safekeeping once again. The gaze does not exhaust itself immediately. It involves perseverance, doggedness, as if animated by the hope of adding to its discovery or reconquering what is about to escape. What interests me is the fate of the impatient energy that inhabits the gaze and desires something other than what is given. It lies in wait, hoping that a moving form will come to a standstill, or that a figure at rest will reveal a slight tremor, insistent on touching the face behind the mask, or seeking to shake off the bewildering fascination with depths in order to rediscover the shimmering reflections that play on the water's surface. So I'm going to finish now and not say much more about this, because I want you to try and, if you can, focus on this quotation and then match it to the final image. And I think they go together hand in glove. And I'll just leave it at that. So I'll follow up with a final image. So till the next time, all the very best and take care.